Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Looting, Loss, and Recovery, a virtual symposium. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation featuring Moses Leff, Rafael Cardoso, and Sarah Abrevaya Stein, moderated by Susan and Elihu Rose Chief Curator, Darsie Alexander, and Lerman-Neubauer Associate Curator, Sam Sackeroff. I hope that many of you have had a chance to view the first part of the symposium, the exhibition walkthrough and recorded lectures, which premiered on the Jewish Museum's YouTube channel earlier this week. Tonight's panel is the culminating event held in conjunction with the exhibition Afterlives, Recovering the Lost Stories of Looted Art, on view through January 9th, 2022, and we encourage you to visit if you are able to do so. Time tickets are available at thejewishmuseum.org/visit. Lead benefactor support for Looting, Loss, and Recovery, a virtual symposium, is made possible by the David Berg Foundation, with additional support provided by other generous donors. We want to take this opportunity to thank the David Berg Foundation for their enthusiastic support and partnership in bringing this program to life. It is much appreciated. I would also like to thank the incredible production team from Sand & Wolf for their diligent work on the video portion of the symposium, and my colleagues on staff at the Jewish Museum, in particular, Nellie Szilagyi-Benedek, Deputy Director of Education and Programs, and Darsie Alexander and Sam Sackeroff for all their efforts and for organizing the exhibition that inspired this program. Closed captioning is available tonight for those who wish to use it. Simply click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen to watch tonight's event with captions turned on. This panel is designed to be interactive, and we very much look forward to your participation. Audience members can submit questions during the panel using the Q&A function. We've already received some questions from viewers during the YouTube premieres of the lectures, which we have incorporated into the moderated portion of the discussion. Thank you again for joining us. And now I would like to welcome Sam Sackeroff and Darsie Alexander to begin tonight's program.
Thanks, Jenna, and thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Sam Sackeroff, and I am Lerman-Neubauer Associate Curator at the Jewish Museum in New York, and one of the co-curators of the exhibition Afterlives, Recovering the Lost Stories of Looted Art. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's panel along with my co-curator, Darsie Alexander. As Jenna mentioned, joining us tonight are Moses Leff, Director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Professor of History at American University, Sarah Abrevaya Stein, Sadie and Ludwig Kahn, Director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies and Professor of History and Viterbi Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies at UCLA, and Dr. Rafael Cardoso, Postgraduate Faculty in Art History at the Rio de Janeiro State University and Research Associate at the Latin American Institute at the Free University in Berlin. In the pre-recorded videos that serve as the first part of this symposium, Lisa, Sarah, and Rafael discuss themes related to the loss and recovery of Nazi looted art and the Holocaust more broadly. In Restitution and Jewish Identity, Lisa discussed the origins of the effort among Jewish scholars turned activists to recover and redistribute orphan Judaica immediately after the war. In Sephardic experiences of the Holocaust, Sarah described the history of the Levy family from Salonika, Greece, using their history to shed light on the experience of Sephardic Jews during the period more broadly. And in A Story of Restitution, Raphael recounted the story of his great-grandfather, the German Jewish banker, collector, and activist Ugo Simon, from whom one of the paintings featured in Afterlives, Max Pechstein's landscape from 1912, was looted, as well as his family's experience seeking its restitution, which was completed this past July. In The Holocaust as History and Warning, Timothy Snyder, Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University, addressed the economic, legal, and ideological causes of the Holocaust, recasting our understanding of it as a historical event that presents urgent lessons for today. Unfortunately, Tim is not able to join us tonight, but I encourage you all to view his lecture if you have not done so already. Having introduced our wonderful panel, I now turn things over to Darsie Alexander, who will begin tonight's discussion.
Thanks, Sam, and welcome everyone. I'm Darsie, the Chief Curator here at the Jewish Museum in New York, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. In the videos leading up to this gathering, the speakers have given us great insight into the range of issues related to the impact of cultural plunder on Jewish life and on Jewish communities. And it goes without saying that one of the most challenging parts of thinking about themes related to looting and the loss of material culture during the war is also considering the loss of human life. And that is always a backdrop to our conversations, both what we're having today and even when we look at the objects that still exist from that time. This history is very much with us. As you'll hear today, the work is ongoing. Heirs and descendants are still attempting to claim family objects seized during the war, and scholars are continuing to make discoveries about the scope, nature, and consequences of the looting. So without further delay, I'd like to jump into our discussion. And I should say from the outset, though, I will be talking to specific people with questions here tonight. I would encourage other panelists who may want to chime in to please do so. So Lisa, I'm actually going to start with you. Because you said something very powerful in your talk when you were describing how objects belonging to Jewish people, and I think you were talking specifically about books and Torah scrolls and other more ritual objects, formed a kind of what you called backbone of Jewish existence. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, and let me just thank you, Darsie and Sam and Jenna, for putting together this program and for including me in it. So, I mean, just to start, there's a practical aspect here, when why the Torah could be called the backbone of Jewish existence, right? For religious Jews, this is a scroll containing the revealed word of God. And that's why, it's the center of synagogue life. And that's why it's adorned with these beautiful crowns and why you use a pointer, beautifully, many of these in beautiful metalwork. To read from it. So in a practical sense, this is traditionally the center of Jewish existence. But of course, in modernity, which is, the Holocaust takes place in the 20th century, not all Jews, even not all Jews in Europe, go to synagogue or are centered around the Torah. And what we see in this moment is that even for them, even for very modern Jews who don't go to synagogue, these objects matter a lot, and it is because they represent Jewish history, Jewish communal existence, Jewish, life over time, Jewish civilization, right? All of the teachings, all of the Jewish culture. And so it takes on a kind of metaphorical meaning for Jews as the precious center of Jewish life. For many modern Jews, that extends beyond Torah scrolls and their adornments and the art that went on them. It's other kinds of cultural property. We see it in the ways Jews talked about other types of Jewish libraries, secular libraries. And much of what appears in this exhibition, cultural property, comes to be seen as the material aspects of Jewish life. One of the things I think is funny is that, in earlier expulsions in Jewish history in centuries past, when Jews would be persecuted and, thrown out of a place, this happened many times in medieval Europe. There wasn't this concern with going back to get the stuff. Jewish culture could replicate itself without necessarily going after things. So even though it would be tragic that Torahs might be destroyed and they're always venerated in Jewish culture, somehow in modernity, as Jews cease to have a single communal life, the material things seem to come to matter more. Maybe when we don't all agree on what the center of Jewish civilization is, the material things come to stand for it.
Thanks for that, Lisa. I'm wondering if I can jump in here and ask, building on those points, can you, and perhaps Sarah and Rafael, you can jump in here too. Can you help us understand why the seizure of cultural property from Jews, why that played such an important role in the Nazis' campaign against Jews? I think this is a question that allows us to address both the ceremonial objects that you were discussing, Lisa, and also the secular objects that that Jewish families own. So can we talk about why the seizure of physical stuff, what role or roles that played in the anti-Semitic campaign against Jews during the war?
Maybe I'll just start. I mean, I think the thing that we can't forget is that some of this is simply about financing the Nazi project. A lot of the looting was actually for items of value that could be sold. And we don't want to forget that. And that's not true necessarily. That's not what the Torah scrolls were about. But much of the Jewish property, including art, but also, forced sales of apartments and people's household effects, were sold for the benefit of the Nazi state. Another aspect, though, is that Nazi looting is part of the genocide, right? We know from the way that genocide later got defined that this cultural expropriation is one element of genocide, taking away, for the very same reasons that Jews treasured these things. They were the center of communal life. The Nazis attacked them.
Right, and you also spoke very movingly about the role of to use the euphemism, research library played in the Nazi campaign. So the seizure of books, which is something that we focus on in one of the central galleries in Afterlives, addresses that many of these objects were stolen and preserved to serve a very different function as part of the Reich. Sarah, were you going to step in as well?
Sure, I'm happy to add to this. I think another element that Warren's mentioned, and here I can move from Lisa's wonderful framing, perhaps bring it to an even more intimate scale without losing sight of the whole, which is to say that the fundamental racism, the race science, the vitriol that fueled the Nazi campaign, of course, as we understand, labeled some subhuman. And this label was extended not only to bodies, but to the things that those people possessed, and to the art forms, the music forms, the literary forms that were associated, whether entirely wrongly or with some perverse grain of complex truth, with those people. And so we see a desire to eradicate the manifestation of cultures that this Nazi, racist, white supremacist vision sought to realize across the territories within its control. This has the effect for the communities in question of compelling them to experience not only loss of life, not only loss of livelihood, not only loss of property, but the loss of attachment to things that were treasured by families, by communities, by regions, as well as by religious communities. And in my own research, which sort of burrows down into the histories of individuals and individual families, we see, and communities, we see the pain with which this material loss is experienced emotionally and spiritually and existentially, not only over ritual objects, not only over Torah scrolls or synagogue adornments, over religious books, but also over, as Lisa mentioned, secular libraries, private effects. The agony of losing these items becomes part and parcel of an experience of dehumanization and of social othering that is furthered by the regime.
That's a beautiful moment, I think, to possibly address, Rafael, some of what you described in the context of your great-grandfather, Ugo Simon. I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about Simon, how you became aware of his story, and also the sense of loss that Sarah was describing, that Simon, of course, experienced, but also perhaps that your family also experienced in the wake of the war.
Sure, yeah. Before I jump in, I just wanted to say thank you also to you, Sam, Jenna, Darsie, for putting this together so beautifully. And I want to also preface my remarks by telling the audience that I'm a little jet lagged. I just flew in to Rio from Berlin yesterday, so I may be a little off on my delivery. Yeah, I think we can't underestimate at all how corrupt the Nazi leadership was. Some of these people are just thieves, and some of these people they took over the German state and transformed it into a parallel state. And I think that's a very important point that people forget, is that often people ask, how could this happen in Germany? In 1932, it was unthinkable that these things would have happened what happened in 1930 from 38 to 41. Not only the Holocaust itself, not only the whole despicable idea of a final solution, but even the many smaller, more mundane things like the confiscations and of property. These things were unthinkable in Germany in 32. It was a society that had a very strict rule of law and believed in its democratic principles. And it's very similar to what we think, the way we think of Germany today. And yet, it didn't degenerate all of a sudden into this terrible, destructive, awful authoritarian state. It was a slow process, and it was a process of about 10 years of brainwashing people and dehumanizing the enemies of the Nazi regime. So part of the dehumanization, I think Sarah used the exact right word. Part of the dehumanization of Jewish people in Germany began with this thing of seizing properties, seizing businesses, seizing apartments, seizing artworks. The whole confiscation thing is a way of saying no one is immune, no one is beyond the reach of our power. And someone like Hugo Simon, my great-grandfather, he was a very powerful man up until 1933. Until February 33, he was pretty much the kind of person that you would have considered untouchable. And then the ground, was sort of swept out from beneath his feet. And suddenly he finds himself being an exile, a refugee. His properties are confiscated, and it's a message they're sending. I mean, it's very interesting. There was a note in the New York Times in March 33 saying banker Hugo Simon's properties were confiscated in Germany, and this is something. It was a big news. It was a big item. It was, how could this happen? You have someone who up to one moment is a secure, powerful person, and then everything's taken away from him. And that's the kind of message that they were sending. That the Nazis were sending this message that they were all powerful, and that they could do this. If they could do this to someone like him, they could do this to anyone. And then, if you look at it with hindsight, as we do, it's a real steady progression from the confiscation of properties from someone like Hugo Simon in 33 to Kristallnacht in 38, and then onwards to 41 in the concentration camps. It's just a slow and steady and very methodical progression from spoliating and destroying a few people to spoliating and destroying an entire people.
I want to jump on that too, if I could, Rafael, because I think you're talking about something there is a method and a buildup over time. But once these confiscations and seizures and coercion, it became at a certain point just totally lawless. I mean, there was something completely chaotic about. It seemed strategic on the one hand, but then it was just, anything was up for grabs, basically. And I guess this is kind of a segue maybe over to you, Sarah, because you've spoken about the Levy family, and the family dispersed after the war, lost touch with one another. And part of your research involved finding letters and documents that actually helped bring family members back together again and sort of add an element of order, perhaps, or understanding of the past through your research. And I wonder if you could talk about what that process was like for you and also what it was like for them.
Thank you. Yes, so the book that I am describing in my contribution to this exhibit follows the history of a single family over the arc of a century and across an incredibly broad global familial Jewish diaspora. that they launch into over the course of the 20th century. But beginning, of course, before the Holocaust era. This is a time of tremendous change. The family came originally from Ottoman Salonika, current day Thessaloniki, Greece. And over the century that my explorations travel, this city, which was once one of the few cities in the modern world to have a majority Jewish population, this city is transitioning from Ottoman hands to Greek hands. It is the community, the city itself, voyaging through so many of the maelstrom of traumas and changes that mark the 20th century, the First World War, population exchanges, the Great Depression, a fire that decimates the community, emigration, and so much more. And the family whose story I am following is also weathering those transitions. And along with this change, and along with the mass migration of Sephardic Jews and the movement out of historic heartlands of Southeastern Europe and Anatolia and the Balkans, it is not only bodies that are moving, but also objects. So as people move, they are carrying things and they are exchanging things, letters, but also objects that may travel across the globe, across hemispheres and back again and in multiple directions. And in tracing this family's history, I was forced to kind of gather together a kind of family archive that was cast asunder by time and politics and the drama of history. Not only materials that the family owned, although that was central to my work, but also material information about these families that had dispersed into archives and libraries across the world. Now, this has a particular twist, of course, when we come to the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust, because the papers of this community, already fragmented by migration and the change of state boundaries and so much more, the papers of this community and of this family then get further fractured during the war, in the course of the seizure of books, libraries, documentation, and after the war, when the Allied forces, and Lisa writes about this so elegantly, begin to tear apart what might have once been a coherent body of material. And therefore, when it comes to Sephardic jewelry, and in the case of this family, Salonican jewelry, the papers themselves, the documents themselves, are forcibly sent into a kind of exile across the world. And so to reconstruct an organic history of a family, which is also a history of a community and of a place that was once a densely Jewish place, one has to go about a kind of reunification process of sources and materials through historical research. For me, this was a wonderful process of discovery, an arduous one and a slow one, but a wonderful one. I think for the family involved, on the one hand, branches of this family across the world, from Brazil to Great Britain, from France to Canada, Israel, India, South Africa, beyond, I was met with their incredible generosity and warmth and belief in the importance of the historical mission, but also inevitably, I think we can understand this on a human level with a kind of caution. What does it mean to have your story written? What will be uncovered? What truths, but also possibly what secrets or what unsavory bits of history? And the question that I carried with me as I embarked upon this family history is, because I have a historian's eye, my question was, at what point over time and space and through diaspora does a family cease to exist as a family? And I think for the family members involved with whom I was interacting, they were asking another kind of question. At what point does one's family history continue to matter? And what relationship do you have to that past and to the dispersed parties across the world? But I was incredibly grateful for their generosity and was sympathetic to their caution. And it was a great privilege for me to be able to encounter history not only through archival documents, but in the homes of family members who really continued to live a family legacy.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I think we're starting to surface a lot of the content that I think made Afterlives so rich for Darsie and I, including the really uniquely intimate relationship between the men and women who owned cultural property that was looted and those objects themselves. Really, the objects and the community constituted each other, which makes the experience of looting so wrenching and so destructive. Lisa, I wonder if we could turn to some of the material that you discussed in your lecture having to do with the collecting points. As you discussed, after the war, the Allies established a network of collecting points, which are facilities to process Nazi looted cultural property for restitution. And you speak explicitly about one collecting point, the Offenbach Archival Depot, which dealt with Jewish cultural property in particular. And you mention the unique way in which staff at the Archival Depot understood their role in facilitating not only the survival of Jewish culture as such, but also its flourishing. And that by restituting or redistributing cultural property, they were really allowing Jewish culture as such to endure. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how they understood their role and the place that they played in this much larger narrative.
Interesting to listen to Sarah talk about this one family and her work of recovery and bringing back together as a historian, and to then compare that to what the Americans did in the collecting points, because there's so many thematic resonances, even though these situations are of course very, very different. The Allies, when they found all this loot that the Nazis had taken from the Jews, it was after they had already pledged themselves to a certain policy. In 1943, the Allies gathered in London and agreed that they would return everything possible to the original owners. I should say that the Soviets did not agree to this, and they had a very, very different attitude towards Nazi loot when they found it. But the French and the Americans and the British agreed to this principle. And that's why those collecting points were set up. That's where the loot that Allied troops found, that's where they brought stuff and they were like, we're gonna return it. And of course that was impossible. I talk about in my lecture that the number of books that it turned out that they found was 3 million. And they were not staffed to read these books. They had initially no one on site who could read any Jewish languages or even East European languages, right? And then they were locked into this policy, which was, if you can't find the original owners, the unit that you return it to is the country of origin. And of course, Jews didn't have a country at that time in 1945. They certainly hadn't had a country in Eastern Europe. And that's where many of these books and other cultural objects have been looted from. So you ask about the staff. Eventually, the staff that are brought in to run Offenbach Archival Depot are people who can read Jewish languages, librarians, archivists trained in library science, who have to, they're bound to these American policies. Right? So they're looking around them. And I think I talk about in my video, the kind of poignant and sad situation they're in, because they see these Jewish books and manuscripts and Torah scrolls, Torah pointers and crowns through the lens of the genocide, but policy isn't letting them treat them as Jewish. And what they're in the position of having to decide is like, should all of these Jewish books go back to Vilna, where there's not much in the way of survivors, and there certainly aren't Jewish libraries or institutions to take them back. And they're kind of in a waiting position for a few years until the US government goes a different path and makes a different decision. So the staff are in kind of a, one of those classic binds before there's a Jewish state.
Right, and this is an opportune moment to mention that part of that next phase in the process is the founding of Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. As you know, a groundbreaking organization that is given the legal authority to receive and redistribute Jewish cultural property that had been deemed heirless or orphaned. And I'll also just mention an organization that worked closely with the Jewish Museum for a number of years. I also just wonder, Lisa, to pick up a little bit, one of the distinguishing features of the JCR, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, is that so many of the 20th century's most esteemed Jewish intellectuals worked on behalf of this effort, including Gershom Scholem, Hannah Arendt. And I wonder if you would say a few words about the sort of model of historical activism and the intellectual project that they saw themselves as participating in. And then Sarah and Rafael, we can continue the conversation along those lines as well.
Yeah, so I mean, as you're saying, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction is founded in New York by Jewish intellectuals who had already been engaged in kind of using scholarship to defend Jews against the Nazis. They've been doing this. They actually founded the journal Jewish Social Studies as part of that effort. And they'd been watching what was happening with the looting. Hannah Arendt, who is the executive director, she had compiled these lists during the war of just lists and lists of seminaries and libraries that had been destroyed by the Nazis. They knew exactly what was happening. And that's like, it was their activism going to Washington and saying, this goes against every principle that the US government uses, but you should be returning this property, not to its countries of origin, but to the Jewish people in the centers of population where they're going to live in the future. And they amazingly persuaded the US government that that should be policy. And that's how Jewish Cultural Reconstruction got its, got given all of the heirless books and other kinds of cultural property to redistribute. They were very persuasive in saying this stuff needs to come out of Europe. And that's where they found agreement with Gershom Scholem. So he didn't actually work with Jewish Cultural Reconstruction. He had his own mission where he was sent by Hebrew University it was the exact same thing. It's like they just sent him to Europe. He went to Prague and then he went to Germany. And his mission was find Jewish cultural property and get it out of Europe, right? Bring it to Palestine, where Jewish scholars are going to make use of it. And I should say, Sam, it's not just Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, though that is probably the one that did the most. But Europe, right after the war, had many Jewish activists, like you're saying, who even acted on their own. Jewish scholars who found themselves there as GIs, who took it upon themselves when they saw many of them acting, I should say even sometimes outside the law, stumbling on synagogues and bringing stuff home and donating it to their local synagogues. There was quite a sense that Jewish life in Europe was over, and that these things that they cared about so much and that they identified as the backbone of Jewish civilization needed to go where Jews were going to rebuild.
I think that's also, it's so interesting because I'm looking at Rafael, and I know that your great grandfather was an activist of sorts, different from the ones that we're talking about here. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the activism of Hugo Zeeman. And I understand that he did have his assets frozen by the Nazis, so he began to sell art to really help the immigrant community. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I'm happy to. He was very active politically during the First World War. He was part of the peace movement, the pacifist movement in Germany against the war with France. And that's when he was together with Albert Einstein and Stefan Zweig and other people who were also against the war. And then immediately after the end of World War I and the German Revolution, he was actually in politics. He was Minister of Finance for Prussia for only for a few weeks because the government didn't hold. And then after that first political experience, he became engaged in cultural politics. That's when he started he became a member of the board of the National Gallery and started really taking his activism to the art world and supporting artists. Then when the war came along, when he was exiled in 1933, he took that to Paris. He went to live in Paris, and he became part of the anti-Nazi resistance in Paris. And he was a backer of the Pariser Tageszeitung, which was a major German language newspaper in Paris. And he was also involved with the whole group of people around Heinrich Mann, people who were trying to set up an idea of an alternative German government in exile. It never really took hold, but they were part of this movement to keep the spirit of the sort of German socialism alive in Paris between 1937 and 1940 when the Nazis invaded Paris. So that was very active with supporting Jewish refugees from Germany, loans for refugees, that kind of thing. But I really wanted to say that when Sarah was speaking, it spoke to my heart because Hugo's image is just one small case in this vast ocean of people who were driven into exile and refugees, and his archive is spread out in so many places. I've been personally to a half dozen archives in France and Germany. There's another half dozen archives in Switzerland. There are letters of his in the archives in Moscow. There's 2 archives in Sweden. It's all over the place, and I've been hunting for it for some time now, and it's interesting to see how it gets spread out. And it's exactly what you were saying, Sarah. It's exactly the dispersal of my family too. I have relatives in Sweden. I have relatives in the United States. I have relatives in Brazil. We've been spread out all over the globe as a family, and the objects were spread out too, and they continue to be spread out. That's what I think is the amazing thing. People think of this. Most people who are not interested in archival research or history, they think of this as something that happened 70, 80 years ago and is over. And it's not over. These things are still happening, and the documents pop up all the time, and new people, new witnesses, new information is always coming up. Barely a month goes by, I don't get an email from someone saying, I have a lead. I knew someone who knew your great grandfather, and I wrote a book about this, which is unfortunately for English language readers is not published in English. But the title of the book, I wrote it in Portuguese. And the title of it can be translated as The Remnant. And I think that's a word that's very meaningful for me, because I don't, people often ask me, readers would ask me, are you the remnant? Are you talking about yourself? I'm saying, no, I'm not talking about people or things. I'm talking about an idea. The remnant is something that stays alive even when people are dispersed, even when objects are dispersed, even when people die, even when everyone is gone, the spirit of who we are lives on, and that spirit is something very it's intangible, but once you start looking for it, it's in all of these peoples, the descendants, as Sarah said, the family homes. It's in the objects. It's in the archives, and it's amazing. Trying to piece that back together is impossible. It's like piecing together the fragments of a bomb explosion. You're never going to find all the little pieces and piece them back together. But even just being able to piece a part of that together is incredibly moving and inspiring experience. You really get a sense of historical continuity, and of how we as a people have been have a history that goes back thousands of years, and it's continuous. It doesn't end at any moment, and it just keeps on transforming and changing and reinventing itself. And that's part of the activism, I think. Getting back to your initial question, I don't mean to digress,
Oh, it's fascinating.
I think the activism is the search for that spirit, the search to keep that spirit alive. And it takes many forms. You know, some people may be pacifists, some people may be socialists, some people may be exactly the opposite. But we have a desire to seek back, to seek the past, and seek who we are, and and seek connection with one another. And that's something which is unshakable and unbreakable. And that's what I meant when I use that title, The Remnant. I think it's something that even when all else has been destroyed, it's still there.
Beautiful. I just want to hold the space open for Sarah and Lisa as professional historians. I wonder if you have experiences analogous to Rafael's, where you've stumbled across or uncovered an archival remnant or an archival fragment, and just maybe speak about what that experience was like personally as a historian who's not only producing scholarship but also participating in this larger community.
Shall I go first, Sarah? Okay. One thing that was really poignant to me related to what we're talking about tonight was Hannah Arendt. When Hannah Arendt went to Europe with Jewish cultural reconstruction to salvage airless Jewish books for redistribution in the United States and other countries outside of Europe, she wrote these field reports. And I think that one of the items that was made, right, that you are showing us exhibition. Yes, it has some of those field reports. So when I was doing archival research, I found a whole bunch of these field reports. And there was one that I found especially poignant. It was from 1950, and it was Arendt going across Germany out of the American zone. She went into the British zone to see what she could find of Jewish books and other looted property to take out of Europe, right? And in this report, she describes going to Hamburg and finding the archivist who was in charge. He wasn't even an archivist. He was like a Jewish communal leader who had survived the war, who would not part or give over to Hannah Arendt the papers of the Hamburg Jewish community. He said, listen, we hid these papers in the municipal archives for the entire Nazi period, including the war. We are not going to hand them over to leave Germany now. And, she walked away and wrote down in her report, like, this is going to be a long process. I'm not going to be able to do this easily. What it said to me was just the layers of loss there, right? I had always taken it as a given that, of course, the Holocaust, after the Holocaust, Jewish life in Europe is over. Of course, it's just the things, and you take them out and you bring them to New York, or you bring them to Israel. And here you have a surviving German Jew saying, we want to rebuild here. And it's a fight among Jews. And that struck me as so poignant, right? That, and just what the loss means, the scale of that loss.
Sarah, you have talked in particular about the Levy family as a Sephardic family from Salonika. And you've also worked very extensively on the history of Jewish communities in North Africa. And I'm just wondering if you can talk more about that research, because it's not so well known. It's not as present in these dialogues.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I could, if we have time, I could also dwell on some of the questions that Lisa,
please.
Rafael are raising about Salonika, because it's so evocative of what is happening. Maybe I'll take a moment to do so. So evocative to what is happening in the immediate aftermath of the war in Salonika and across the Salonican Jewish diaspora. Cecil Roth, the Anglo-Jewish historian, travels to Salonika in 1946. The city is in ruins, and he is seeking to travel through the city to find remnants of Jewish culture. And he describes seeing a young child who is an apprentice to a shoemaker with a cut out insole for a shoe made from a Torah scroll that has been desecrated and cut. And he acquires that insole, and it now exists in Roth's archive. The families, I will say, who did not have the resources, the means, the clout, the emotional wherewithal to travel to their native city at a moment like this, 1946, are nonetheless doing their best in their dispersed locations across the world to discover what has become of the objects, the people, the bodies of the dead. Even as news of Europe is only slowly filtering to them, I think about one of the characters I trace in my book, Family Papers, who wants so desperately in the immediate aftermath of the war to find the body of his father, to bring it back to Salonika for burial next to his mother. Now, he does not realize that his father, who was in his 80s, was among the oldest generation annihilated in Auschwitz, where most Salonican Jews were gassed. Nor does he realize that the body unobtainable, of course, nor does he realize that the cemetery itself in Salonika was desecrated during the war, dismantled actually by the Greek municipality with the permission of the Nazi occupiers. So what I'm trying to say is that families and individuals across the world are engaged in their own emotional and logistical struggle over treasures, whether those treasures are bodily remains or objects. And this is such an intimate process across the Sephardic and general Jewish world. So, but Darsie, you really asked me to make a transition to North Africa. And it is, I must say, a rather dramatic transition. Because when we move from Europe to North Africa, we are moving to a context where the Holocaust was relevant. Certainly the Second World War is relevant, but not in the same way that it unfolds for European Jewry. So to explain, North Africa at the time of the war is home to some 20 million Muslims and a smaller Jewish population of about 500,000 spread out across North Africa. These 500,000 Jews find themselves subject of three different occupying regimes during the Second World War: the Italian fascist regime in Libya, the regime of Vichy France in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria for different periods of time, and direct occupation of the SS in Tunisia for a period of months. In these places, fascist occupation, Second World occupation, overlaps with histories of colonialism and intersects with histories of colonialism, including complicated histories of what legal statuses people held, intersecting with complicated legal histories and cultural histories of who owned what cultural property or physical property. So this is an incredibly complex political landscape of occupation. One of the things that's really important to mention is that there is never a policy of genocide meted out upon the Jews of North Africa, although some North African Jews and Jews of North African origin living in Europe do get sent to the death camps and where they are annihilated. But there isn't a systematic deportation of Jews from North Africa. However, across the territory occupied by Vichy France, by the Nazis, and by the Italian fascist regime, there is the unfolding of policies of racially identifying Jews from others, of segregating Jews from others, of seizing property, of pushing Jews out of the professions, and finally of inflicting forced labor and imprisonment on Jews, as well as upon foreigners living in North Africa, including European Jewish and non-Jewish refugees. So it is a very complicated landscape that I've been seeking to unpack with my colleague Omar Boom in a series of book projects, and one that is has until now been really woefully underappreciated, but it is a central part of wartime history, not only of military history, but of strategic jockeying for power. And the war and the Holocaust unfolds in ways that affects variously in North Africa, Jews, Muslims, and refugees. And the refugee population itself is an incredibly modeled one. So one can scarcely do it justice in just a few moments. But what I would say in conclusion is that this is a very complex and important landscape of the Second World War, and it has a place in Holocaust history that, alas, has been overlooked until recently.
Thanks for that, Sarah. That's a great opportunity, I think, to pause here if we can, to consider issues of restitution in a larger global context. So although, as you know, the focus of this panel is the restitution of property looted from Jews, many other communities have been subject to looting and plunder that are now seeking restitution. And I wonder for the panel in general, if your familiarity with looting and restitution in the context of the Second World War has informed your understanding of looting and restitution more broadly. Rafael, I know that you wrote only recently about the case of the Parthenon marbles for hyperallergic. I wonder if you could first, Rafael, summarize your views there quickly, and whether they were informed by your own personal experience around restitution, and then Sarah and Lisa, if you have comments about restitution from non-Jewish communities, I'd be also eager to hear your thoughts. Rafael, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think there's definitely my views have been informed by my archival research and family history. There's no doubt about it. I think it's very important to see the parallels, to look at the parallels, and not try to push them aside. The looting done under colonialism has a lot of parallels to the looting of Jewish people during the Second World War. I think we have to recognize that these state apparatuses, the state powers that's constituted at different times in history, it's geared to spoliating people, to stealing things from people and giving them to someone else. And we have to really have a lot of solidarity, awareness of what's going on with other people too. I think when these governments or powers try to do this kind of thing, the strategy is always divide and rule. You know, there's always Jews against Muslims and Africans against Europeans. It's always a strategy of trying to make people hate each other, and then those who are abusing power find it easier to abuse their power because everyone is divided against everyone else. So I think it's very important to understand that what's going on today with restitution and repatriation of formerly colonial objects is something that holds strong parallels to the Holocaust era restitutions. And really, I think we have a legal precedent and historical precedent to help people make more sense of colonialist looting. So, in the case of the Parthenon sculptures, for instance, the article that I wrote was about sticking to principles. That we really have to talk about restitution as a matter of principles and not as a matter of convenience. So, I was arguing against a previous article that had been written, saying that it's more important to restitute some things than other things, and I'm saying that's absolutely not right. We have to stick to our principles and restitute what has been spoliated, no matter who it's been spoliated from. It's really a matter of doing what's right, seeking justice, as the Washington Principles say, seeking a just and fair solution for everything that's all the past wrongs. And so I think we shouldn't try to distinguish between wrongs or establish hierarchies that one wrong is more wrong than another wrong. all wrongs are terrible and all wrongs should be righted. So, and that's, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's part of my heritage too, is thinking about, principles of justice that are applicable to everyone, independently of nationality or ethnicity.
Do you want to, do either of the two of you, Sarah, or at least I'm looking at you, do you want to offer up any thoughts to Sam's question?
I mean, yes, I would love to. I'm not sure which way the influence is going, and I think it's interesting that so much of the discussion around art looted from Jews started to happen around the same time that we also see museums starting to confront items in their collections that have been taken from Native Americans or from tribes through violence, and many sacred objects. And that those things are happening at the same time. And I think what they point to together is the importance of provenance research, the weakness in many cases of international law to settle many of these claims, and the need for museum professionals to develop really solid, as Rafael was saying, codes or practices that honor the history and are, have strong ethical commitments to recognizing these histories and trying to do what's right, even when the law is not there, right? Even when there's holes in the legal system.
Sarah?
Well, I might just add to that, that I think when I think about, when I research, when I teach about Holocaust history, which I do at UCLA frequently, it is very important for me to explain to my students the ways in which the Holocaust unfolded in dynamic interaction with pre-existing histories of colonialism and race violence and racism, and that this genocide is not cannot be segmented off, but must be understood to be part of a global story of violence, including the violent management or eradication of bodies and things, the theft of things and land, of course, and land. And the Nazi regime was well aware of this and looked to colonial cases for precedent, were informed within their own military by earlier cases of German genocide in German-controlled Southwest Africa, looked to the treatment of Native peoples in the United States and its model of reservations to inform at least not necessarily always realized ideas, but some realized and some not realized ideas of how to manage occupied peoples and land that the regime understood to be, subhuman. So that, to return to the question, I would say that it is not so much that studying the Holocaust offers us lessons for looking to other cases of genocidal violence or of theft of land or property or cultural treasures, but that these histories were historically always connected, and therefore their legacies continue to be intertwined in complex ways that inform the present.
Well, that's I just have one final question for the three of you to be answered in no particular order, and then I think we're going to open it up. But I think this conversation has really illuminated the tremendous strides that have happened over the years in the research, in the restitution cases that have been successful, in these stories coming forward. So the question is really kind of a where are we now question, and what really remains as the three of you look to the future, what remains to be done? What feels like it is the most pressing next step in this field of research and study? Lisa, I can see you reaching for your mic.
I'm eager to say something, which is, I think more work in the spirit of this exhibition, which brings to light not just the art looted itself or the other cultural objects looted themselves, but these subsequent histories. I think too often we think of that as like post facto or something that you have in your records in the back of the library or in the back of the museum, or, you know, in my synagogue here in Washington, DC, we have a Torah scroll that has a Holocaust history. Making those histories known and talking about those, I think, is the next step. And that's both for the sake of research, you know, but also just for getting some of these ethical concerns addressed in public. You know, it's part of justice also.
Rafael, any thoughts?
Yeah, I want to echo what Lisa just said. I think the Afterlives exhibition is a great model for the museum world, especially in the U.S. Museums are not always forthright about provenance. Many museums know the provenance of the works. They know they have problematic works. They know they have looted works, and they don't talk about it. They just sweep it under the rug. And, you know, to pretend like everything is so, they pay homage to the great collector who built the museum and who donated the painting, and they don't talk about where these things come from. And that's, you know, we're just way past that moment where it's, this has to be left behind, you know, in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century now, and it's absolutely vital for museums to talk openly about where the works come from. You know, if you go to the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt, they have, you can actually view the collection. They have a little audio guide where you can view it through the lens of the dealers, of certain art dealers like Falkenfeld or Kassir, or people who were major modernist dealers in Germany, and you can view how they're painting, how the works that they sold are exhibited in the museum. That's a very progressive way to exhibit provenance. You know, you're showing the links between the works in the collection, whereas other museums, you know, they close off their archives. They refuse to let provenance researchers from outside the museum into the museum, and they sort of build this smokescreen around their collections. And I think that's just really, really shameful in the 21st century. That museums have to be open. We have to get a conversation going about provenance. You know, some museums, like I said, like the Stadel, are very progressive about this, and some museums are absolutely black boxes. So, and I don't mean to point fingers or accuse anyone. You know, I think this is all over the world. This is not in any one specific country. It's just we have to get museums up to a higher ethical standard, where we're talking about provenance and restitution, repatriation, and what is ethical property, what is not ethical property. I think that's a very, just the whole moment that we're living through now with the colonial era of restitution claims and repatriation claims. I think it's a very good moment. It's a very positive moment, because museum boards and museum donors are being confronted with this attitude of not talking about where their collections come from. And we really do have to talk about that. It's not going to go away. You know, people think, I think before the Gurlitt case in 2015, people thought, Holocaust era restitutions are sort of coming to an end. And actually, it's just all blown up all over again. So it's ongoing, and it's bigger than ever. I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. You know, we have. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk about statutes of limitations or that kind of thing. But I know that the situation now for Holocaust era restitutions is even more pressing than 6-7 years ago. So I think we have to take an example from the colonial era restitutions and talk about a bigger problem, which is how museums are constituted and how they set up their collections.
Thank you. Sarah, before we switch over to questions, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would say that I'm really heartened by this exhibit, by the choices Darsie and that you and Sam and Jenna have made around including the Sephardic story and even within this presentation, touching upon the North African one within a broader frame, because that is really a very new innovation. And it is sadly not one that all museums or exhibits embrace. I've worked very closely with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, with Lisa, as has my colleague Omar, with whom I'm doing so much writing on this topic. And we see other key Holocaust museums and collecting centers, Yad Vashem, really trying to broaden their scope to still gather testimonies from Sephardic or North African, not only Jews, but Muslims or refugees who were caught up in the region. So I would say, I still think we have work, we historians have work in fleshing out stories that have been undertold, undersold. As much as we look forward to new approaches, new innovations, new kinds of syntheses, I think we still have our work cut out for us looking backward and filling out a complete story.
Thank you so much. Sam, I know you're starting to field some questions and we're at that time. Do you want to take over and start?
Of course. Thanks so much. So kind of in the spirit of where this conversation sort of has led us, the first question comes from Wesley Fisher, who many of you will know from his longstanding work with the Claims Conference and other organizations that'll be familiar to all of us here. Wesley asked, a lot of what we've been discussing with respect to Jewish cultural reconstruction had been the redistribution of cultural property that had been orphaned or heirless, and that Lisa, as you mentioned, was redistributed to Jewish communities outside of Europe under the belief that Jewish life in Europe had come to a decisive end. And Wesley asked that now that there is a revival of Jewish life in Europe, whatever problems there may be, is it time to revisit where those communal items belong? Is it time to revisit some of the decision-making that informed Jewish cultural reconstruction, and what might that revisiting entail?
Yeah, so I mean, I've never heard anyone talk about finding the actual books redistributed by Jewish cultural reconstruction and trying to send them back to, say, the communities of, Jews coming from Russia and settling in Germany. And that would be actually incredibly difficult, because when those books got integrated into Jewish libraries in the United States, either in synagogues or in large collections like at the Jewish Theological Seminary or Hebrew Union College, they didn't get separated out as JCR books. So in many places they had the book plates, but they just got integrated into the collections, right? So it would be impossible to take those specific books. And that's why I'm saying, like, the next frontier is like what they're doing, I understand, at Penn Libraries in Philadelphia, actually doing a project to identify separately those books. But that, I mean, most libraries are never going to be able to do that. So this would be impossible. The question is, can that same spirit of helping to rebuild be turned back to Europe? And I think that that is an absolutely important endeavor, and obviously something that the Claims Conference itself has done a lot to support. And that includes cultural, that includes helping support libraries, helping support cultural life, not just the support of people. And I think that's one of the lessons in these stories, is that helping Jewish people also means paying careful attention to cultural life.
Thank you so much. The next question has to do, Rafael, with something that you may be able to speak to. As we know, there are many different varieties of cultural plunder and looting. There was outright theft, which would involve really kicking down a door and taking something. But there are also sales under duress and other forms of expropriation. And one of our audience members asks, what is being done to free records or to make records available from auction houses that have dealt in works that experience those sorts of more ambiguous varieties of theft. And I wonder whether you can speak to any of the personal experience you may have had grappling with some of those kinds of cases.
Yeah, well, it's really case by case. You know, there's I wouldn't want to generalize. I think it's difficult because the art market is historically a very secretive business, so it's not at all transparent. And sometimes it's very hard to get access to these archives. Sometimes you just get a door slammed in your face. So some museums are doing very good work and moving in the right direction. It's also, I think we need more pressure from governments. We need more regulation of this kind of thing. The Washington principles are great, but they're just principles. They're not legally binding. And even the Washington principles, which were fairly, loosely designed, they're only intended to govern public bodies and not private collections. So the hardest thing is getting information out of private collectors and art dealers. They just don't want to show you. I mean, I've had art dealers lie to my face. Oh, there's no record of any transaction with their great grandfather in our house in our dealership over the 1920s and 30s, and I know that's not possible because he was buying and selling from these people. So. And what can you do? You can't do anything. If the person says that they don't have any archives, then that's it. There's no law against that. So even if you know that that's not true, I think we need to think about more pressure on the judiciary too. The judiciary obviously is different from country to country. Laws are different. But judges are not always confident about what they can or can't do under the law. I think we need more precedent about sales under duress, for instance. I mean, to me, it's quite obvious that if someone is a refugee, as my great grandfather was in Paris, selling works of art to sustain his activism, to actually support artists and writers in exile. And that's his only source of income. That's the way he's getting money to do what he's doing. I think it's obviously not. He's not selling them. He's not selling the works to have to buy other works. He's not selling the works to have a nice holiday on the Riviera. He's selling the works as a matter of life and death, not only for him, not only for his family, but for an entire community. And if you take that to court in many countries, in Switzerland, for instance, you say, well, that was a sale under duress, the judges will say, no, it wasn't. There's a legal contract. It was sold from a neutral country to another neutral country, and there's nothing we can do. That may be a technically correct argument. I mean, I want to emphasize I'm not a lawyer, so I think that may be a technically correct argument, but that's also a political argument. I think we need pressure from lawmakers and from people who are actually organizing the judiciary branch to think about how can we address these issues, because it's just too easy for these people to say no law was broken. I mean, it may sound even very naive, but there are several moral laws that were broken there, at least. So if no law was broken, then I think that the legal system is broken, and we need to fix it.
Well put. There are several questions here that Sarah and Lisa, you may be able to speak to, asking about the Soviet Union, what happened to cultural objects that fell under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. And also one questioner asks about the degree to which the Soviet Union or now Russia has made archives available to researchers. I can't speak to this myself, but the questioner implies that there has been more proactive movement toward restituting archives as opposed to other forms of cultural property on behalf of Russia. So as researchers, have you had much experience with accessing Soviet or post-Soviet archives? There are a number of people who are interested in that part of this history as well.
Sarah, you want to talk about the Greek stuff, or?
Well, I will answer very tersely with reference to my own research, and Lisa, I suspect you'll be able to put it in a slightly broader frame. I know of late there has been a movement. I saw that the person who asked this question asked specifically about the Greek Jewish archival material that had been seized by the Soviets in the immediate aftermath of the war. There has been an effort by the relevant Russian institutions, archives, to duplicate this material with the assistance, I'm not sure about the funding behind this, but of American institutions. So for example, at the library, at the archive of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I believe also at YIVO, if I'm not mistaken, you can now see the duplicated contents. I think I saw this in DC at the Holocaust Memorial Museum's archive, the duplicated context of the Soviet-owned materials from Greece, from Thessaloniki, from Salonika. The originals, as I understand it, remain in Eastern Europe. But I do not believe that I don't believe there has been such forthcoming movement in terms of objects as in terms of these particular archives that are actually identifiable in some senses, more organic, things like the communal archive over a long period of time, which remained as a sort of physically coherent. But Lisa, surely you can help us contextualize that.
Well, I would just say, more kind of, more broadly, there's a scholar who's done a ton of work on what's called the twice looted archives, Patricia Kennedy Grimstead, who's really the expert on this, who's really traced how, archives looted by the Nazis then were looted by the Soviets and what those subsequent stories. So I can't pretend to know anywhere near, I refer you to that, but some things were returned. The Nazis looted not just from Jews, but in occupied countries, they also looted archives, like they've looted at the French National Archives. A lot of what has been returned, say, to France was state archives, like the archives of the telephone and the postal system, for example, but also private papers. Some were returned, and it's true that the archives are more, things that are returned than other works. Rafael, you may know about works of art. No.
No, not really.
Well, I have one final question that is that I think is a fitting note to close on, because it really underscores the personal the personal nature of this much larger history. And this is directed to you, Rafael, but I also invite Sarah and Lisa to comment as well. Some of our audience are asking what happened to Ugo Simon after the war. I know that the question asks if he reconnected with Stefan Zweig and other peers and colleagues, but I also know that his post-war experience was in some ways as harrowing as his wartime experience. And I think it's important to maybe close here on reflecting on that fact, if you would.
Yeah, it was not. He did not have a good post-war experience. He fled to Brazil under a false name, a pseudonym, with false papers. He had no proof of his real identity. So after 45, basically his task was to try and get his identity back. That was the first step. He had no documents, no valid passport. He couldn't travel to Europe to do anything really. So he made some claims. He sent in some claims to the French state. There was no German state between 45 and 49 the petition. So he really didn't know how to address claims besides the French state, and he couldn't go back to Europe. And finally, he died in 1950. It was very tragic because he did not manage to reclaim his identity before his death. Although he had great references, people vouching for him, he was unable to reclaim his identity, and much less his properties. So it's I think it's a perspective that's not usually seen in the U.S. because most of the Jewish people, Jewish exiles who went to the U.S. are the ones who actually were able to rebuild their lives after the war. And in Latin America, many of the people that went to Brazil, to Mexico, they were just never able to rebuild their lives. So the trauma of that is very great. I think that in the case of my family, my father, for instance, he would never talk about this. He was a child refugee. He went to Brazil when he was 10 years old, and he just refused to talk about any of this. He never went back to Europe in his life. He was not interested in reclaiming his identity, anything. So it's taken 3 generations to move beyond that trauma to the point where we can actually talk about this and address claims. And I always say that when people say, "Oh, it's this is ancient history. There should be a statute of limitations," I say, "Well, you obviously know nothing about the trauma of being a refugee." When I see these refugees now today, my heart goes out to those kids. I see my father and every one of those 10-year-old boys. And I think it's going to be generations and generations before they're ready to, before their descendants are able to deal with that, or able to even talk about it. And, we really have to be more sympathetic to these histories. These histories, the trauma can be inflicted very fast, but getting over the trauma can sometimes take decades, centuries. And so I don't know. I've sort of lost track of what I was saying, but I think we have to really be sensitive to these histories.
I don't think that there's a better note to end on than that. So thank you so much, Sarah Stein, Lisa Leff, Rafael Cardoso. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in. Darsie. Fantastic.
Great night.
Yeah, thanks again. And please do, this panel will remain available to stream. And I do encourage all of our audience to please view the lectures online. Those are available for you and will continue to be available. So again, thank you all for joining us.